Tom, it's great to be here. I'd love to just go over my background first, just so your listeners can get sort of a feel from where I'm coming from. So, have spent about a decade in the federal policy space. I started out as the chief speechwriter to Senator Orrin Hatch, who is the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. So, with the responsibilities he had on the Finance Committee, I wrote a lot about international trade, different financial issues, different regulations coming before Congress. And that's where I was first introduced to blockchain. It was more of a avocation on the side, though. It was something I did more in my free time. But from Senator Hatch's office, I popped over to K Street, which is sort of the Wall Street equivalent of the lobbying world. So I worked for the US Chamber of Commerce for a while as the speechwriter to the president and CEO of the US Chamber. And there I deepened my knowledge and expertise in economic issues, again, issues related to international trade, but also dipped my toes into emerging technologies as well. And then I jumped over during COVID to the think tank world. I worked for the Orangey Hatch Foundation, which is a national think tank focused on essentially bridging the partisan divide. And there I helped lead up our policy programming on crypto. So we actually hosted Senator Lemus, the crypto queen of Congress, for a virtual symposium on the future of the crypto economy. As your listeners may know, Senator Lemus has been very avant-garde in the crypto space for many years now. I think she bought Bitcoin back in 2014, 2015, so an early adopter, definitely. And then after that, I took some time off of work to go to Princeton to do a mid-career master's degree in public policy. And there, I really dove deeper into different issues related to blockchain policy. I was able to take my research and repurpose it into different op-eds on matters related to crypto. One was published in the National Interest. Another op-ed on stablecoins as tools of economic statecraft was published in Fortune. And that eventually led to an invite from Forbes to become a Forbes contributor on digital assets. So that's just some of my own background in federal policy generally, as well as blockchain specifically. I just continue to write today for Forbes. What I've been looking at specifically is the interplay of blockchain and government regulation, especially as it relates to the presidential race going on right now, different regulations coming from the SEC to try to crack down on the industry, what Congress is doing in response to that. And also, we can't forget about the CFTC. They're also trying to regulate crypto on their own terms as well. So that's just some of my background for your listeners.
It sounds like you were in Washington kind of during the early days of crypto when some of us who were fools thought it was a scam, including me, other people, were the early adopters and probably made quite a bit off of it. Give us a little bit of history into the U.S. government's policy and kind of standpoint on crypto from where it started to kind of where it is now.
Yeah, I'd love to. So when crypto first started, let's go all the way back to the publication of the Bitcoin white paper written by Satoshi Nakamoto. So the government didn't really pay much attention to it. I think like a lot of people in the federal government thought it was a scam or that it was a fad, something that wouldn't last long. But over time, like I mentioned, Senator Lummis, she was a member of Congress at the time. I believe she was in the House, and she bought her first Bitcoin. And so there were definitely some very forward-looking members of Congress who realized, no, this is a technology that's here to stay. This isn't just a passing fad. And so they started to adopt it on their own. And of course, within federal agencies and among congressional staff, there were people who believed in it as well. And so it really didn't become an issue that the government paid much attention to, though, until the late 2010s. That's, I believe, the first hearing on crypto was held in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. But again, it didn't get much publicity. People didn't pay that much attention to it. When the government did start paying attention in earnest was during 2017, during the ICO craze. So ICO stands for Initial Coin Offering. And the SEC, in large part, they recognized that there were some shady dealings going on there where a lot of ICO offerings could very well be considered the selling of unregistered securities. And so they wanted to get involved on that front. But still, Congress was very much hands off. I would say that it didn't become a mainstream political issue until the most recent bull run we had in 2020 and 2021, when a lot of money was being made and a lot of political donations were being given as well. So as some of your listeners may remember, you have SBF and the FTX scandal. So a few people know that SBF was actually one of the highest in terms of volume donated, he was one of the biggest donors in the last election cycle. If I'm not mistaken, I believe he was actually President Biden's second biggest donor. And so when you start mixing money and politics, that's when people start to care, and that's when it became a mainstream issue. But after FTX blew up and that whole debacle went down, there's been this phenomenon in Washington, which is understandable that a lot of people who took money from crypto have tried to distance themselves from it in any way they can to sort of protect themselves politically. And so I think that's what's led to some of the backlash against it. Both Democrats and Republicans alike were singing crypto's praises pre FTX and post FTX. You've seen a noticeable shift, especially on the part of the Democratic Party, in wanting to regulate crypto and take a firmer stance against it. And so the dynamic you have right now is you have Gary Gensler, who's at the SEC, who is very antagonistic towards crypto. And I could walk through sort of the evolution he's had because he wasn't always that way. But a lot of Democrats in Congress have started to defer to Gary Gensler and his stance on crypto and taking their own positions on it. So I don't want it to become politicized, but there is a risk of that happening. And so it's definitely something to pay attention to.
Yeah, because it seems like, from what I understand, it initially the SEC said that it was not considered security, which for regulatory purposes means a totally different set of implications than when they recently sued him and saying that now it is a security. So what's Gary Gensler's motivation to all that? That's a big shift. It's kind of confusing. I mean, I think like
Yeah.
most people in the industry, like early on, I remember I was at a fintech conference. I think it was like 2017, and kind of the overlaying attitude was like, we're going to be transparent and work with regulators. That's how you do something where you're kind of in this gray area, which is totally confusing. Like when they say one thing and then it's completely pull 180.
Yeah. No, that's the big question. What are Gary Gensler's motivations? And I can walk through some of that. So let's go back to 2018. Gary Gensler is giving a speech at a Bloomberg event before a group of hedge fund partners. And in that speech, he says definitively, he doesn't mince any words, he says Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Ether, and Litecoin are not securities. He makes it very clear. And that's a marked difference from his stance today, which is essentially that all cryptocurrencies other than Bitcoin are essentially securities. And so, how did he make that shift? Why did he make that shift? It's a very interesting question because around 2018 as well, Gary Gensler was teaching a course at MIT called Blockchain and Money, in which, if you watch some of his courses, it seems like if he's not agnostic towards crypto, he might even be sympathetic towards it. And in 2019, Binance lawyers alleged that Gary Gensler actually reached out to Binance and gave them an offer to be an advisor to the crypto exchange. And then you have this last week, the SEC is suing Binance for selling what he claims to be unregistered securities. And so, again, it's a really interesting question. Why did this evolution happen? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons behind it. One of them is that to understand Gary Gensler, you have to recognize that this isn't a run of the mill regulator. This is a wily political operator and a master of media manipulation at the end of the day. This man knows exactly what he's doing. For context, he became a partner at Goldman Sachs when he was just 30 years old, which at the time, he was the youngest partner in the history of the firm. And so this is somebody who really does know how to maneuver the political ranks, if that makes sense. And when he got to Washington in the late 90s, he relates the story in one of his public courses from MIT that he had this old political lawyer from Texas take him under his wing and say, young man, you know nothing about this town. If you want to get good policy, it all starts with a solid message. The message is everything. And once you get a good message down, then you can focus on politics and eventually on the policy. And so, one thing Gary Gensler is incredibly good at is drilling home on a message. Like I said, he knows how to work the media. So I've been a speechwriter and ghostwriter for the last decade, right? And one of my mentors told me once that whenever you write an op-ed or an opinion piece for a newspaper, one of the tricks is you need a hook. You need something that can grab your audience and essentially reel them in, right? And one of the best ways to use a good, effective hook is to pick out something in pop culture that's making a lot of viral news online. And the Kardashians actually are always a really good option for that. So Gary Gensler intuitively knows this, though. His biggest splash into his anti-crypto campaign was actually last fall when he came out swinging by suing Kim Kardashian, of all people, for touting what he considered to be an unregistered security and not disclosing that she had been paid for it. So that's something that made big news. And he knows exactly how to preempt every move that Congress does to essentially take the wind out of their sails whenever they're trying to move the ball forward on crypto. So you can look at the timing of some of the things he's done. Like I mentioned, he just recently sued Coinbase and Binance, the two biggest crypto firms in the world. And the timing of those lawsuits was not by coincidence. He announced that they would be filing those lawsuits around the exact same time that Congress unveiled a new crypto framework, which was one of the best and most positive developments in the space for the last couple of years, honestly. So he knows exactly what he's doing. Why is he taking such a firm stance against it? In large part, I think it's to distract from other things. Under Gary Gensler's watch, the Biden administration has had an ambitious agenda on ESG and market structure. And in all honesty, Gary Gensler has failed to deliver on either one of those objectives. In addition, under Gary Gensler's watch, you've had major banks and hedge funds blow up. But what he's been able to do, instead of directing the spotlight towards him, he's taken it and he's shifted it over to crypto. Crypto, at the end of the day, is just a really useful whipping boy for people in Washington because it's an upstart industry that has nowhere near the lobbying power or the influence of incumbent traditional banks. And so it's a really easy target. And I think he has made it, whether intentionally or not, part of his legacy. I think Gary Gensler, wherever he goes from here, he'll always be remembered as being the anti-crypto chair of the SEC. And again, it's just something that he's been able to do to build up reputation for himself in DC as a no-nonsense regulator, as someone who will attack any industry and not be afraid of it. At the end of the day, it's all to expand his own political capital. And the question is, where does Gary want to go next from here? That's sort of the big speculation in Washington. And some people think that he has been eyeing the Treasury Secretary position and that he's made a deal with Elizabeth Warren to be his champion in Congress were he ever to be nominated to that position. There are some people, though, who have pretty good knowledge of what's going on, who've thrown water on that idea, though, and speculate that it's more likely he might be angling for an ambassadorial position in a future administration. So it's uncertain, but it definitely seems like he has taken such a firm stance against crypto for his own self-interest, to expand his reputation nationally, to build political capital, to shore up his reputation among specifically progressive Democrats on Capitol Hill as well. So that's some of the ideas behind it. But yeah, remains to be seen. But that's kind of how I view it, just as someone who's been in Washington and has seen some of these regulators work the system the way they have.
So is he suing Binance specifically for their coins, saying that like BNB is a security, or is he saying that all crypto is a security, including like Bitcoin and Ethereum and some of those?
Mm-hmm. So he did, if I'm not mistaken, he did label BNB, which is Binance's coin, as security. Coinbase actually doesn't have their own token, but what the SEC has done is they've listed a series of tokens. I think it's about 10 of them, which consist of the greatest trade volume on both platforms. And he's labeled them, the SEC has labeled them as security. But it raises an interesting question because in 2021, the SEC, lest people forget, the SEC approved the IPO of Coinbase. And that honestly begs the question, why would the SEC approve the IPO of a company that it now accuses of selling unregistered securities? It just doesn't make any sense. If that actually was the stance within the SEC at the time, that Coinbase was selling a series of unregistered securities, they never would have allowed it to have become a public company. And that's the thing, and that's what's frustrating, is that the SEC has taken this public stance. At least Gary Gensler has taken this public stance that there's no lack of clarity in the industry. There's only a lack of compliance, which is honestly disingenuous because, as you can tell, back in 2021, if the SEC cleared this IPO, there were people within the SEC who thought that Coinbase was above board, that they weren't doing anything shady. And so it really just doesn't add up. And there's a number of other lawsuits that are going on in the background as well, in which certain documents have been released, which again show a lack of internal consensus in the SEC itself on what these digital assets are. Are they securities or are they something else? Do they deserve their own asset classification category altogether? The truth is, there is no consensus within the SEC on that point. But Gary Gensler seems to be selling the SEC as if that were the case, but it's honestly not. And that's what's frustrating people in crypto. They just want clarity at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I could see like how it would be considered, I guess, from like a technical definition of how it would be considered a security. But I think the problem comes to like that they said it wasn't a security, so everyone's gonna operate off of what they said. Like that's kind of how regulation works, especially when you're operating in a gray area.
Right,
You look to them for guidance.
right.
But it also seems like there may be a larger trend within Washington. Because I know also during the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, the acquiring banks didn't take on, as far as checking accounts, they didn't take on any of those crypto companies that were depositors at the banks that had gone bankrupt, that basically had gone bankrupt, got taken over. Do you think that there's a larger push? Because I know the Biden administration came out in some policy basically saying that they didn't see any real use for crypto. Do you think that there's a larger trend? Maybe it's partisan, maybe it's just the U.S. government as a whole is trying to kill crypto.
I do, yeah. I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as the US government as a whole, and that could probably vary from administration to administration. But there definitely are factions within the US government who are unabashedly anti crypto. So, just an example of that would be the Fed. The Fed has, for obvious reasons, they look askance at the cryptocurrency industry because they recognize that the Fed sets the monetary policy, really not just for the US, but for the world in a way. And what crypto offers is the ability to opt in to your own monetary policy. And that's a real threat to the Fed's power, right? And so, an example of that is you recently had a stablecoin bill that would have allowed stablecoin providers in the US a regulatory pathway to build stablecoins and do it in a regulated above board way, and B, to bank directly with the Fed. Interestingly, the Fed does not like this bill, it's rumored, because they want to have separation from anything related to cryptocurrency, if that makes sense. And so you definitely see there's this push within Congress, but definitely from the SEC and in certain other areas of the government to try to crack down on crypto. And it's something I've written about in the past. More and more, I think you'll see a new dividing line in American politics between those who are pro centralization and pro decentralization. And that has enormous implications for the future of our political culture. And you're already starting to see it take shape in the presidential election. So we were talking before we started this podcast, Tom, about different presidential candidates who have come out and essentially endorse Bitcoin, or at least mention that they're willing to craft policies that will allow people to own and sell Bitcoin to their heart's desire. And so a couple examples are Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's on the Democratic side of things, and then Ron DeSantis, who's a Republican candidate, as well as Mayor Suarez, who's running for the Republican nomination as well. All three of them are very pro Bitcoin and very anti CBDC. What's interesting about that is for example, Ron DeSantis taking a position that CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies, um, should not be developed, he's more or less forcing Democrats to take a side on the issue as well. And I think Democrats will be reluctant to do it because CBDCs, at the end of the day, they do centralize government power. They do increase the likelihood of government surveillance as well. And to come out and take a position that that's a good thing is not a winning political issue. So it'll be really interesting to see how it all shakes out over the next few months.
Yeah, I mean that CBDC. It seems kind of dystopian. Like I think crypto and kind of the decentralization aspect of it is kind of one thing. I know probably a lot of people have kind of a dystopian view of the future of the world with kind of how geopolitics are shaping up and AI and potentially what that's going to do. But I think decentralization is kind of like one positive light a lot of people see in the future, especially with technology. And it seems like the CBDC, on the other hand, is very centralized. It's kind of dystopian. Like we see what's going on in China with their cryptocurrency, and they'll show how much control they potentially have over whether or not they want to let you buy something. And I think that that is a bit concerning. I mean, I know here in the U.S., obviously there's the rule of law and there's checks on power, but those can erode over time, and it does seem concerning.
Definitely. I think of it in these terms. What a CBDC is at the end of the day is programmable money. In other words, it's money that the federal government could turn off and on when it decides. And that's a terrifying prospect when you really think about it. We saw sort of a teaser of what CBDCs, uh, what implications they could have for free speech in the winter of 2022 when you had the trucker protests in Canada. So the Canadian government was trying to cut off funds to the Canadian truckers, and actually crypto and specifically Bitcoin was used as a way to circumvent the obstacles that the government was throwing in place to fund the truckers. But then what happened was you need an on ramp and an off ramp to crypto to be able to turn Bitcoin into fiat currency, for example. And what the Canadian government did was they did everything they could to shut off their off ramp. So, I mean, here you have a group of Canadians who, whether you disagree with their protests or not, they were exercising their free speech. And then you have the Canadian government trying to limit their free speech by turning off their money, essentially. So it's a really dangerous prospect. It's a central planner's dream, to be clear. If you're an economist who wants to use micro targeting stimulus to say, okay, this particular sector of our economy is flagging right now. Let's say it's retail. So let's drop a stimulus check uh, to Americans across the country that will they can program the CBDC in such a way that that money can be spent only on retail. It can't be spent on food or anything else. And so it allows essentially central bankers to micromanage our finances. And to me, that's a terrifying prospect. And at the end of the day, money is political. And when you turn over the sole, your own ability to use and spend money to the government, that's a huge abdication of freedom at the end of the day.
Yeah, it sounds like from what you mentioned earlier, kind of with gold and silver, that it's not unprecedented for the government to kind of crack down on competing currencies. I know gold and silver. I don't know if you know what you want to consider that currency, but for a lot of the history of the world, it was. For a while, it was illegal to own gold and silver, and that was specifically so it wouldn't compete with the dollar, from what I understand, right during the gold standard, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's talk about that because like I said, that could also have very interesting implications for the future. So few people know there was an executive order in 1933. It's called Executive Order 6102. So obviously this was during the depths of the Great Depression. And FDR, who was the president at the time, he wanted to inject more liquidity into the economy. The problem was people were hoarding gold because they were uncertain about the economic future. They were uncertain about the strength of the dollar. And so to do everything they could to hold on to something that held value, they were keeping gold, in their banks and their homes. And he essentially issued an executive order that made it illegal to hoard gold, that all but required people to hand over their gold to the federal government and exchange that for cash. So if people think that the government won't try to crack down on Bitcoin in the event of a severe economic crisis or even a fiat crisis. They just need to look to history. There is a precedent for that. The only issue is it's a lot harder to seize Bitcoin than it is to seize gold. Gold is a physical object that, of course, the government can come in and take. What Bitcoin is at the end of the day, it's something that can be stored essentially as a series of numbers and letters, essentially a password in your head. And short of torture, the government can't take that from you. So that is definitely one advantage that Bitcoin has over gold. That's what makes it effective as a form of digital gold, is that it's much harder to seize and it's much easier to carry around with you. But could the government, if this divide between decentralization and centralization widens over the coming years, could the government try to ban Bitcoin or try to seize Bitcoin or other cryptos in some way? It's certainly possible, and it's definitely something that people invested in the industry have considered that it could happen. Hopefully it doesn't, but never say never.
Yeah, I think one thing that would probably complicate it is that now Bitcoin is a legal tender of a couple countries, El Salvador, and I believe is it the Central Republic of Africa, um, which that may make it a lot more. I think that they could run into legal hurdles trying to ban it, unless it's like a sanctioned country, which they're not, and you're not going to like allowed to go in it or something. I think it would create a lot of legal hurdles. No.
It definitely could. And I think what you'll see in the coming years is more countries adopting Bitcoin either as legal tender or a currency that you trade in from day to day. The truth is, Bitcoin isn't going away. I mean, governments can't ban Bitcoin or crypto any more than they can ban the internet. The only thing you could do is unplug the internet itself, and that's not really a possibility. So that's what another thing I wish more regulators and government understood is that this technology is here to stay. The only question is whether we will be a global leader in helping build an industry around cryptocurrency and blockchain, or if our regulations will drive innovators offshore. That's kind of the key question right now, why a lot of people in the industry are pushing back so hard against the SEC's crackdown and are writing to their congressmen and saying, we need to do something to build a foundation for this industry to thrive in the U.S. Because if we don't, we could be missing out on a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity that could really push our economy forward into the next decade.
Yeah, I think another aspect of it is so like a while back we had a crypto entrepreneur who had originally moved here from Belarus, and he brought up the point that in a lot of countries, especially ones that tend to abuse their currency quite a bit and have untrustworthy governments, it is kind of that bridge to the normal world for people who they probably don't agree with those governments, but they're obviously forced to live under their rules. I think Bitcoin has the potential to kind of erode some of those authoritarian governments' powers. So I think that's another positive outlook to some of the decentralization that could potentially get eroded.
I agree with that 100%. I recently heard Bitcoin described as a cypherpunk human rights tool because at the end of the day, it does put a check on centralized power. And in different governments around the world, especially autocratic governments, there has been massive Bitcoin adoption and massive cryptocurrency adoption. I think Venezuela is a great example. So, inflation in Venezuela over the last decade has been one of the worst places in the world in terms of just severe inflation. So what you have there is you have the masses adopting Bitcoin, but also stable coins in huge numbers. So actually, that's another interesting topic is stable coins, because what the US government should realize is that crypto is not an enemy, it's a friend. And stablecoins might be the greatest friend to the federal government that we could find in a new technology. And if I could just explain that a little bit. So, what stablecoins are, I'm sure your listeners are probably familiar with them already to a certain extent. A stablecoin is a cryptocurrency that's pegged to the value of the US dollar. So there's a spectrum of stablecoins that are very risky and stablecoins that are more secure. And the most secure stablecoins are backed by US treasuries and physical cash. So USDC is an example of a stablecoin that's worked really closely with government regulators to try to do things above board. Well, I think a lot of these people in Congress, Elizabeth Warren being foremost among them, these people who are fighting crypto, who have formed what they call the anti-crypto army, what they don't realize is that stablecoins themselves, which essentially are cryptocurrency, they are possibly the greatest tool we have for supercharging dollarization abroad. We're living in a time right now where countries are looking to ditch the dollar if possible. You have BRICS countries, so BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They're essentially near peer competitors of the US. They've banded together to discuss just the possibility of building a new currency that could be the alternative to the US dollar. What we don't realize is that you have countries with severe inflation and even entire regions of the world where stablecoin adoption, independent of any help from the US government, has been massive. So, South America is a perfect example. 1 in 3 South Americans has used stablecoins before. I mentioned Venezuela earlier. More than a third of all small retail transactions in Venezuela happens in stablecoins. Why is that? It's because inflation in these places is so bad that people get their paychecks, and the money that they get, on the day of their paycheck could be worth uh, half of what it is just a year from now, right? Because their currency is inflating away. So what they do is they get their paychecks, they convert that immediately to these US dollar stablecoins, and it's a way for them to find a refuge from inflation, as well as to be adopted into the US dollar economy. So that's I'm trying to raise attention for just the amazing opportunity we have in US dollar stablecoins. I've called it recently the best opportunity since Bretton Woods to increase dollar adoption abroad. Because again, once you recognize that crypto has incredible use cases, I think stablecoins being foremost among them, that's when we can put regulations in place that will help crypto become mainstream in not only the U.S. but also the global economy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think one thing that we haven't discussed that I think may be motivation for the crypto crackdown is the U.S. government loves to spend money and loves to print more of it. And it seems like if you do too much of that, especially start creating some inflation, that the natural instinct is to go towards other currencies. And then kind of while that's been going on, at least the inflation, um, the U.S. did some pretty unprecedented sanctions against Russia, which obviously they had good reason for doing it, but they haven't been very effective. I think part of that is because Russia is mainly a commodities economy, so it's very easy for them to barter. And then obviously the whole BRICS thing that happened. I think that did scare a lot of other countries that they were able to basically seize all that money. Do you think that that's a big motivator? How do you think BRICS is going to affect cryptocurrency as a whole? Because I mean, investing in a currency that China and Russia have a big part of doesn't seem particularly trustworthy.
Mm.
How do you think that's going to affect crypto?
It's an interesting question because China and Russia have also been going really heavy in buying gold recently. And it's hard to say that gold is political, right? At the end of the day, gold is an asset that is viewed as something that is a protection against inflation, right? And I think that Bitcoin might be seen in the same way. So let's assume that the BRICS countries do adopt Bitcoin in greater numbers. I think it's a long shot just because Bitcoin is still so unstable. But let's say they start to integrate it into their trades, for example. Um, there might be a greater push from the US government to crack down on Bitcoin, but at the end of the day, it might just be recognized as a new form of gold and something that the US government uh, would have a vested interest in investing in as well. A lot of people don't realize that actually one of the greatest holders of Bitcoin today in 2023 is in fact the US government. If I were a policy advisor in the Biden administration, let's say at the US Treasury, and there was talk of selling off Bitcoin, as there is right now, I would advise against it. And that's for the simple reason that let's suppose that this could become a form of digital gold, right? The market cap of gold today is $10 trillion, sometimes closer to 11 trillion. So let's assume that Bitcoin were to become the next gold, which I don't think is that long of a shot. That would put Bitcoin's market cap at around 10 to 11 trillion dollars, which would make Bitcoin worth about $500,000 per Bitcoin, which is hard to fathom right now. But again, not an impossibility, right? So in my view, the U.S. government shouldn't even sell its Bitcoin as an insurance policy of Bitcoin becoming the next gold, as well as an opportunity to have something in place. Again, this is a long shot. I think the US dollar system is strong. It has a lot of detractors for sure. And it has become more politicized in recent years. But let's say there were a fiat crisis and you needed something to peg the US dollar to. It would be really helpful to have a lot of Bitcoin on hand in case push came to shove, in addition to gold. So that's kind of my viewpoint. Yes, that could, if the BRICS countries did adopt Bitcoin in greater numbers, that could put more pressure from the US government to ban Bitcoin. But at the same time, I don't think it's that different than BRICS countries or any other country buying gold. So that's kind of the perspective that I see it from.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, and one question I have: so back during the Colonial Pipeline ransomware, which was one an unprecedented attack on critical infrastructure, and then also there was the unprecedented event, which the FBI basically seized the Bitcoin. So somehow they were able to track it and then seize it, which we actually discussed in a different video. How do you think cybercrime overall has affected public stance on Bitcoin and crypto overall? In fact, probably in this video, to give you an example, we'll probably have a couple spam bots. Every time I put something about crypto, there's a couple spam bots that'll comment on it.
Right. So, unfortunately, a lot of the negative media coverage comes from the fact that we have to be honest, crypto is used a lot of times in cybercrime. What people don't recognize is that the US dollar, as in physical cash, is used in similar numbers to carry on illicit activities as well. In fact, if you're an enterprising criminal, however, you have a greater interest in using US dollar physical cash as opposed to cryptocurrency to carry out your crimes. And that's because cryptocurrency, what people don't recognize is that it's completely trackable. You can see everything that happens with that cryptocurrency on the blockchain. Some of your listeners may remember Silk Road, which was back in the early 2010s, if I'm not mistaken. But Silk Road was essentially a black market that was set up on the internet where people were transacted completely in Bitcoin. Since Silk Road happened, a lot of people have been prosecuted for crimes for buying illicit materials on this essentially this black market internet marketplace because the FBI can go back and see everything they did. It's all on the blockchain, right? There are certain tools that people can use to sort of cover their tracks on the blockchain. One of them is Tornado Cash, which essentially mixes your crypto, and so it makes it a lot harder to track where that crypto has gone. But governments are cracking down on that as well. So I think we need to be honest that yeah, cryptocurrency it is used in cybercrime, but there's also definite drawbacks to any criminal trying to use cryptocurrency as opposed to US dollar cash. And we have to be honest, I mean, money in any form is going to be used for uh, illegal activity, but there's drawbacks to doing it with cryptocurrency and potentially some benefits as well. But it's not a slam dunk. I think that's one of the greatest criticisms of crypto is, oh, it's just used for illicit activity. It's clearly not. I mean, it is used for illicit activity. We can't deny that. But the FBI and other government agencies, they definitely have systems in place, and they're becoming more adept every day using tools and working through companies like Chainalysis, which essentially their job is to do forensic work on the blockchain to crack down on illicit activity happening on the blockchain. So there's pros and cons for criminals using it, and to say that that's its only use case, I think, is entirely disingenuous because, like I said, there's a lot of drawbacks for criminals who use cryptocurrency as a form of transaction. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but that's my take on it, more or less.
Yeah, I mean, I think early on, if you were to use cryptocurrency for cybercrime or crime in general, it was more anonymous. But I think that that's completely eroded out. To your point, like everything is on the blockchain, and there's a lot of ways that if you put enough effort, you could trace it back to an identity. I think probably now it's probably one of the worst things you could do if you're trying to anonymously transact. As we get to the end here, so if people want to find you for more insights, where's the best spot to find you?
Yeah, so my Twitter is at Sam Lyman 33. That's SAMLYMAN 33. And I write at Forbes every month. So if you just Google Sam Lyman Forbes, my page will come up. But yeah, I would love to connect with your listeners and follow up with them if they have any more questions or anything like that. And yeah, it's been a great conversation, Tom. It's been one of my favorite things is to talk about crypto. So this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to put the links to those in the description. I mean, I think podcasting and some of the kind of independent media is kind of a good example of decentralization as well. I mean, actually, a little different context, but I mean, I think like 10 years ago, you wouldn't really be able to get a lot of this information because you basically had to go to one of three news networks, which had some partisan interests, and then also have probably a business model. They have to sell things that are going to or put stuff up that's going to sell to the masses and monetize versus some of these smaller ones. We could talk about more niche things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the internet, specifically social media, is an invention that's on par with the Gutenberg press, in the sense that the Gutenberg press, it was one of the most important decentralizing technologies of all time. You know, it wasn't just a printer; it's what essentially brought down the Holy Roman Empire at the end of the day. It gave people the power to read and write and challenge the existing authorities at the time. And what the internet has done is it's put in a Gutenberg press in everybody's hands. And so the fact that we can even have this conversation on this podcast that we're having right now, or even carry it onto social media, I think is a huge blessing. And one of the reasons why I love crypto in the first place is because I think decentralizing technologies are a check on centralized government power. And at the end of the day, they are a incredibly powerful tool for freedom and democracy. So I'll keep writing about it. And yeah, if anyone in your audience has any questions, tell them they can connect with me at any time.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely make sure to check out the links in the description and you can find them there.